Hi, and thanks everyone for coming. I'm Elizabeth Bradfield, Robert Pinsky, and Monica Youn, and we're all really happy to be here in the gorgeous Hawthorne Barn tonight. So I'm going to introduce Monica and Robert fairly briefly, but there's a lot to say about both of them, so it won't be a tweet. And then have them read their poems for a few minutes. We'll have a conversation, and I'm hoping that you folks will bring your questions into the room as well, because we'd like this to kind of evolve and go into strange channels, hopefully, although not uncomfortable ones. Okay. It is really an honor to introduce both Robert Pinsky and Monica Youn, both of whom most of you in all likelihood know already. They need little introduction. And I've spent the past month intensively reading and immersing myself in their work, and it's been an incredibly mind-opening experience. So for those of you who are new to their work, of course you're in for an amazing treat. They both range in subject, style, and tone, always smart, always curious. Here's a couple of lines from each of their work. This is from one of Monica Youn's poems. When you have left me, the sky drains of color like the skin of a tightening fist. And from Robert Pinsky, the engraved hook shape of Normandy brass, keys from seashells in the Mekong, reed from Belize, listen, labor. There's music in here, there is the materiality of the world, there is everything that you want a poem to offer. And both of them are poets who work toward enlargement. Their poetic hungers are to reach outward and connect unexpected things in the world, and to make them matter to us, to make us discover how they matter, which is, in truth, the best gift poetry can offer. To be intellectually rigorous, imaginatively daring, and still warmly human. Even though both present their poems on the page very differently, those essences thrum through both of their work. And I'm really thrilled that we'll hear from both of them tonight. So for the official bios, Monica's going to read first, and then Robert. Monica Youn is the author of 3 books of poetry, Barter, I don't know how to say Ignatz. Okay, Ignatz, which embodies and explores and enlarges the enigmatic inner life of Crazy Cat, and most recently, Blackacre, which riffs on an old legal term coined in 1628, still common today in property law, that denotes a fictional plot of land, much as Jane Doe signifies a generic woman. It won the William Carlos Williams Award of the Poetry Society of America. It was also a finalist for the National Book Critics Circle Award and the Penn Open Book Award, and was longlisted for the National Book Award, as well as being one of the best poetry collections of the year, named so by the New York Times, the Washington Post, and elsewhere. Her poems have been widely published, including in Poetry, The New Yorker, The New Republic, and more. The daughter of Korean immigrants and a former lawyer specializing in election law, she was raised in Houston, Texas, and now lives in New York. She's a member also, and this I'm curious to hear more about, is a member of the curatorial group, the Racial Imaginary Institute, which is an organization conceptualized by Claudia Rankine and founded in 2017, an interdisciplinary range of artists, writers, knowledge producers, and activists. And she also chairs the Lewis Center Committee on Race and the Arts. So, I guess I'll introduce you both, and then we'll go on. Robert Pinsky is a poet, essayist, translator, teacher, and speaker. He was the Poet Laureate of the United States for 3 terms, unprecedented, 1997 to 2000, and in that time launched the Favorite Poem Project, which continues rigorously to this day, a place for people in the United States to share poems that are significant to them, and why they are so. An honoring of the special critical space poetry holds in their hearts. He has translated Dante. He has written books of criticism like The Sounds of Poetry, which generously invites the non-academic reader to more deeply understand why and how poems move them. Robert Pinsky is the only member of the American Academy of Arts and Letters to have appeared on The Simpsons and The Colbert Report. And then there are his poems themselves. He is the author of 10 collections of poems, many of which have been awarded some of our most prestigious literary prizes. His most recent collection is At the Foundling Hospital. I think I just want to hear from you now. I think that's enough for me.
Well, I think I've been tapped to lead off this evening, so let me do so. Am I all good? All right. For some reason, I have the myth-making on the brain today. I was walking along the beach for a surprisingly long time. And so I was going to start with this poem. And also, this is a poem that starts with an etymology, which is something that Robert and I often do in our poems. I think both literary context and emotional context would probably be helpful. Emotional first, this is a poem I wrote for my mother, although she doesn't know that, when she was in a time of crisis, when she was about to turn 70, and my father, her husband of 45 years, suddenly left her, moved out, and she was terrified. It was if, she was raised in Korea. She has never lived by herself before, and she felt as if the central fact of her life had been ripped away. He did come back, but I was thinking about that when. And in terms of the mythic context, so etymologically, catastrophe is kata, like under, like catacomb, right? And trophy, trope, to turn. So catastrophe is a downturn. And the poem also references the Greek goddess of necessity, who is often figured as a weaver. Portrait of a hanged woman. The Greeks had it wrong. Catastrophe is not a downturn, not a fall from grace. No, it is the sudden, terrible elevation of a single point, one dot on the topography of a life. That is the crux of the punishment, the singling out, then that brutal uplifting. It is as if a steel clamp had seized upon one square inch of a flattened canvas map, then jerked sharply upward, the painted landscape cracking along unaccustomed creases, cities thrown into shadow, torqued bridges twisting free. A life is not this supple. It is not meant to fold, to be drawn through a narrow ring. The Greeks were wrong. Necessity is not a weaver. There is no spindle in her hand. It is a woman wearing a steel collar, wearing a stiffly pleated dress, which lifts to reveal nothing but fabric where her body used to be. And maybe I'll continue with another poem to my mother. This one also mythological. This is based on Norse mythology, so because I'm nothing if not eclectic. So the Norse tree of the world, as many of you will know, is Yggdrasil. It is the tree that holds up the many worlds, and there are many, many myths surrounding it. I think the two most relevant here is it functions as a little mini ecosystem. I mean, there are squirrels who pass messages up and down its trunk. There is a serpent dragon twining around its root. There are surprisingly 4 deer that live in its branches, and also the father of the gods, Odin, once hung in a lifeless state from Yggdrasil for 9 days in a kind of rebirth, at the end of which he came back to himself and received the gift of the runes, the gift of language. Hangman's tree, Yggdrasil. To see a living thing, a badly damaged thing, and to fail to understand how life still catches hold of it and clings without falling through, like water falling through a bowl, more fisher than bowl. Just as a bowl must be waterproof, a body must be life-proof, we assume, as if a life were bound by laws of gravity, always seeking a downward escape. But then there is this olive tree. If tree is still the word to describe this improbable arrangement of bark and twig and leaf, this tree ripped in 3 pieces down to the ground. No longer a column, instead a triple helix of spiraling bark verticals sketching the outline where the tree used to be. No heartwood. Very little wood left at all, the exposed surfaces green with moss, dandelions filling the foot-wide gap at its base. And still, the tree thrives, taking its place in the formal allée that edges this gravel road, sending out leafy shoots and unripe olives in the prescribed shapes and quantities, lizard haven, beetle home. I was wrong when I told you life starts at the center and radiates outward. There is another mode of life, one that draws sustenance from the peripheries. Each slim leaf slots itself into the green air. Each capillary root sutures itself into the soil. Together, these small adhesions can bear the much diminished weight of the whole. I won't lie. It will hurt. It will force you to depend on those contingent things you have always professed to despise. But it will suffice. It will keep you alive. Want to repeat, my father did come back. Things are okay. And this is another kind of mythology. I mean, one of the things I was thinking a lot about in this book are, the sort of stories you grow up with, what kind of twines itself so deeply into your sense of self that you don't even know it's there. And I was thinking about this particularly. A lot of this book is about infertility and my own experience of infertility. And I was thinking, why does, there's not only the medical fact of it, but there's also the societal shame of it, the stigma. And where does that come from? Where do we learn to stigmatize our women who are infertile, who are aging, who are unfaithful? And I was thinking of the stories I was told as a little girl, and one of them was Peter Pan. And Peter Pan, if you read J.M. Barrie, is a very beautiful and a very sinister book. It is one in which there are these little boys, the Lost Boys, and they really want this little girl, Wendy, to come to Netherland and to be their mother forever. And so it's explained in the book that at one point they're waiting for her arrival, and they want to build a house to convince her to stay. And so all that's lying around on the ground, apparently, are these red oozing vines. And so they build this house for Wendy, and it's this red oozing, sticky, veiny looking house, and you're like, ooh, is this a symbol for something? Let me see. So the epigraph is from the book, Redacre. Of course, Slightly was the first to get his word in. Wendy, lady, he said rapidly, for you we built this house. Oh, say you're pleased, cried Nibs. Lovely, darling house, Wendy said, and they were the very words they had hoped she would say. And we are your children, cried the twins. Then all went on their knees and, holding out their arms, cried, Oh, Wendy, lady, be our mother. Ought I? Wendy said, all shining. Of course, it's frightfully fascinating, but you see, I am only a little girl. I have no real experience. In a scheme to entice her, they fashioned a shrine with jewel work of berries, with crewel work of vines, red mullions flaunting flocked velvet drapes, rose-patterned carpets in plush-piled heaps. At the pulsating heart of this upholstered nest, a snug seat like a socket that whispered of rest. But I can't be your mother. I'm not ready yet. And the eaves of the little home slumped with regret, and its sorrow turned inward, turned acid, turned foul, and corrosion traced stencils in slime on the wall, and the draperies puddled in ponds on the floor, and the overripe cushions ruptured like sores. The seat melted to nothing. A hollowed-out void drained away everything in a purgative flood, more taboo than urine, and a fluvial flow streamed toward the sewers, a liquefied no. Wide-eyed and wide-mouthed, she gaped in dismay as pearl-like the possibles went floating away. And I'll end with this one from a slightly later phase of childhood. This is so in junior high, there was this legend in my high school. This is pre-internet, so there was no way to check these urban legends, right? And that Twinkies, the baked goods, weren't actually baked. They were sort of this goo that was extruded and then exposed to a chemical catalyst, so it foamed up and it grew this golden outer layer on top of the white inner layer. And I believed this for decades until I actually came to researching this poem. It's also relevant that in my junior high school, Twinkie was also an epithet for someone who is yellow on the outside and white on the inside. I should also mention, so this poem, see, it looks like this. And there's an as if, and then there's a sentence. And I did that because the as if puts the sentences into the subjunctive, right? The subjunctive in English is how we talk about fantasy or unreality. But what's interesting is in English, the subjunctive is often indistinguishable from the past tense. You are becomes as if you were. And so I was thinking, well, what is it about us? We like to cloak our fantasies in trappings of history, in trappings of historicity, of pastness. And particularly you see this when people are talking about race, this idea that things were better back in the day, right? You see this in Gone with the Wind, in Aryanism, in what is the value added by the again, in Make America Great Again. Goldacre. As if you were ever wide-eyed enough to believe in urban legends. As if these plot elements weren't the stalest of cliches, the secret lab, the anaerobic chamber, the gloved hand ex machina, the chemical-infused fog. As if every origin story didn't center on the same sweet myth of a lost wholeness. As if such longing would seem more palatable if packaged as nostalgia. As if there had once been a moment of unity, smoothly numinous, pellucid, as if inner and outer were merely phases of the same substance, as if this whiteness had been your original condition, as if it hadn't been what was piped into you, what seeped into each vacant cell, each air hole, each pore, as if you had started out skinless, shameless, blameless, creamy as if whipped, passive as if extruded, quivering with volatility in a metal mold. As if a catalyzing vapor triggered a latent reaction. As if your flesh foamed up, a hydrogenated emulsion consisting mostly of trapped air. As if, though sponge-like, you could remain shelf-stable for decades, part embalming fluid, part rocket fuel, part glue. As if you had been named twin, a word for likeness, or wink, a word for joke, or ink, a word for stain, or key, a word for answer. As if your skin oxidized to its present burnished hue, golden as if homemade. Thank you.
Such a pleasure for me, and I'll say an honor to be here with the author of Vignettes and Blackacre. I recommend those terrifically musical and imaginative books to you very much. I just love being here with Monica, and I'm grateful to Joshua and Elizabeth as well. And Joshua, of course, saved me the trouble of figuring out what poem to begin with. Branca. Ralph Branca was the 15th of 17 children. This poem is not the poem of the speaker. His father was an immigrant from Calabria. These words are those of Robert Pinsky, speaking. Branca wore Dodger uniform number 13. Speaking is the punchline of a Jewish joke. Some Romans call Calabrians Africani. Brooklyn had its own daily, the Brooklyn Eagle. At 85, Branca learned about his mother. He was 21 when Robinson joined the Dodgers. At 11, I loved Robinson for his daring, running the bases, stealing home, his fire. Branca was one of the few who befriended him. I was too young to understand his mission, the fuel of that dancing to taunt the pitcher. Robinson never forgot Branca's kindness. What the old man found out about his mother is she was born a Jew in Hungary, Kati. After he gave up the most famous home run ever, back in the clubhouse, Branca lay weeping, face down. Kati gave birth to 17 Catholic children. The Giants won the pennant, 1951. Branca means claw, a fit name for a pitcher. His teammates thought it best that he cry alone. But, quote, only my dear friend, Jackie, who knew me so well, came over and put his arm around my shoulder. The Nazis killed the aunts and uncles Branca didn't know existed until he was old. 42, in itself a nothing of a number. The Dodgers traded Branca to the Tigers. Grief, with its countless different ways and strains. Glory, a greater thing than success, but slower. Some of the Tigers who had been Giants explained to Branca how the Giants had stolen the signs from opposition pitchers. The telescope in center field, wires, buzzers. Branca chose not to talk about it. It's all in Prager's book. His research unearthed Kati, those aunts and uncles. The Dodgers were taken from Brooklyn by their owner. I, Robert Pinsky, choose not to say his name. I didn't live in Brooklyn, but I knew the score. I knew it was a kind of underdog place. Nowadays, once a year, all major leaguers wear Jackie Robinson's number, 42. In the joke, the person who answers the telephone at Goldberg, Goldberg, and Goldberg keeps replying that Goldberg is out of the office. And so is Goldberg. Well, all right, let me talk to Goldberg. Speaking? Robinson spoke to Branca. If not for you, he said, we never would have made it this far. There's a great American historian who loved that poem. I got nice notes, including Joshua, about the poem. And he said he just didn't understand the thing at the beginning. This poem is not the poem of the speaker. This is a man who's written biographies of, Lyndon Johnson and Robert Moses. And he had no idea that in our little province of poetry, students say, the speaker says, the speaker in Ben Jonson's poem on the death of my first son says, I think it's Ben Jonson. I'll read a couple of poems that poem reminded me of as I was reading it to you. This poem is called Creole. I am very interested in impurity. Intellectual, racial, ethnic, religious. Purity is scary to me. I tend not to like purity. So I arrogate to myself this word, Creole. Creole. I'm sick of the gods. I'm tired of the gods. I'm pious about the ancestors. afloat in the wake widening behind me in time, those restless devisers. My father had one job from high school till the day he got fired at 30. The year was 1947, and his boss, planning to run for mayor, wanted to hire an Italian veteran, he explained, putting it in plain English. I was 7 years old. My sister was 2. The barbarian tribes in the woods were so savage, the empire had to conquer them to protect and clear its perimeter. So into the woods, Rome sent out missions of civilizing governors and forces to establish schools, courts, garrisons. Soldiers, clerks, priests, citizens with their household slaves. Years, decades, entire lives were spent out in those hinterlands, which might be good places to retire on a government pension, especially if in your work years you had acquired a native wife. Often I get these things wrong, or at best mixed up. But I do feel piety toward those persistent mixed families in Gaul, Britain, Thrace. When I die, may I take my place in the wedge widening and churning in the mortal ocean of years of souls. The Roman colonizing and mixing, the imperial processes of legal enslaving and freeing, involved not just the inevitable fucking in all senses of the word, but also marriages and births, as developers and barbers, scribes and thugs mingled and coupled with the native people and peoples. Begetting and trading, they had to swap, blend, and improvise languages. Couples, especially, needed to invent French, Spanish, German, those Creole languages. And I confess, I, Roman barbarian, I find that Creole work more glorious than God. The way it happened, the school sent around a notice. Anybody interested in becoming an apprentice optician, raise your hand. It was the Great Depression. Anything about a job sounded good to Milford Pinsky, who told me he thought it meant a kind of dentistry. Anyway, he was bored sitting in study hall, so he raised his hand, and he got the job, as was his destiny, full-time after he graduated. Joe Chavone was the veteran who took the job, not a bad guy. Dr. Weinberg did get elected mayor. Joe worked for him for years. At the bank, John Smock, an Episcopalian whose family once owned the bank, had played sports with Milford, and he gave him a small loan with no collateral. So he opened his own shop, grinding lenses and selling eyeglasses. As his mother-in-law said, almost a professional. Optician comes from a Greek word that has to do with seeing. Banker comes from an Italian word for a bench, where people sat to make loans or change. Pinsky, like Tex or Brooklyn, is a name nobody would have if they were still in that same place. Those names all signify somebody who's been away from home for a while. Schiavone, or Chavone, means a Slav or slave. Milford is a variant on the poets' names: Milton, Herbert, Sidney, that certain immigrants used to give their offspring. And Creole comes from a word meaning to breed or to create in a place. I think it's incumbent on me to read a poem that doesn't have my name in it. I've written many poems that don't have my name in it. This won't take that long. Okay. Shirt.
Yeah, me too.
Shirt. The back, the yoke, the yardage. Lapped seams. The nearly invisible stitches along the collar turned in a sweatshop by Koreans or Malaysians, gossiping over tea and noodles on their break, or talking money or politics, while one fitted this arm piece with its overseam to the band of cuff I button at my wrist. The presser, the cutter, the ringer, the mangle, the needle, the union, the treadle, the bobbin, the code, the infamous blaze at the Triangle Factory in 1911. 146 died in the flames on the 9th floor. No hydrants, no fire escapes. The witness in a building across the street who watched how a young man helped a girl to step up to the windowsill, then held her out away from the masonry wall and let her drop. And then another, as if he were helping them up to enter a streetcar and not eternity. A third, before he dropped her, put her arms around his neck and kissed him. Then he held her into space and dropped her. Almost at once, he stepped to the sill himself. His jacket flared and fluttered up from his shirt as he came down, air filling up the legs of his gray trousers like Hart Crane's bedlamite, shrill shirt ballooning. Wonderful how the pattern matches perfectly across the placket and over the twin bar-tacked corners of both pockets, like a strict rhyme or a major chord. Prints, plaids, checks, houndstooth, tattersall, madras, the clan tartans invented by mill owners inspired by the hoax of Ashen to control their savage Scottish workers. Tamed by a fabricated heraldry, McGregor, Bailey, McMartin, the kilt devised for workers to wear among the dusty clattering looms, weavers, carders, spinners, the loader, the docker, the navvy, the planter, the picker, the sorter sweating at her machine in a litter of cotton as slaves in calico head rags sweated in fields. George Herbert, your descendant is a black lady in South Carolina. Her name is Irma, and she inspected my shirt. Its color and fit and feel and its clean smell have satisfied both her and me. We have called its cost and quality down to the buttons of simulated bone, the buttonholes, the sizing, the facing, the characters printed in black on neckband and tail, the shape, the label, the labor, the color, the shade, the shirt.
Wow, thank you both, Robert and Monica. There are so many places to begin. I'm really curious to hear from both of you about how etymology drives both of you, and how, when did your use of etymology start, and how do you find it driving poems in a different way than when you began?
I don't know when my interest in etymology started, but it certainly was sharpened by my practice as a lawyer. Kind of common law is a practice of finding history in phrases. I mean, you take cruel and unusual punishment. I mean, to take that to a judge and to be like, well, I've looked up all these words in a dictionary, you would be laughed out of court. What that word is the sum total of its usages over time. I mean, the word, exists as if in historical hypertext, and you click on it and you get this wonderful pass through history. And I feel like, a lot of the words we use, windows open when it achieves a certain historical simultaneity when you use these terms and you kind of understand what it is that they mean. When you, I remember being curious one day about writing a poem about the word cataract, like how it can mean both a waterfall and also an eye a problem with the eye, and it turns out cataract is from the Latin cataracta, portcullis, right? A door that has closed, that grill work. And to know that is to be able to stitch together in time all of these moments, the way that I think Robert so often does in his poems.
A lot of people don't know that Monica and I are blood relatives.
Yes. I'm his father.
She engendered me long ago.
And begot you.
I had looked at cataract in that same spirit,
Exactly.
that it was a door that comes down like this, and they thought that's why your eye clouds up. One I love is sometimes I always say I used to love to read the dictionary as a kid, and I loved reading it and wandering around in it. And it's much more interesting to look up words you know the meaning of than words you don't, because I even loved the style of the dictionary. Any of several forms of blah, blah, that, I just fell in love with it. It was my favorite book when I learned how to read. And one I love is thing, the word thing. It was a verb. Thing on the parliament, I think it's in Iceland or Denmark, it's still called the Thingstead. Thingon is to discuss. To thing is to have a conference, avoid violence by talking. And so it became like the modern expression, when he has a thing about that, it's a thing. It comes from, it's literal. And everything is a chorus of voices. I feel like in the poems I read, I seem to be more preoccupied with being Jewish than I really am. But I can't help saying that as a child, I did hear another language than English. And my mother and my grandmother spoke Yiddish with one another. And I was very aware of the sort of Germanic sound of some words and the Latinate or French sound of other words. I thought about it. It's a wonderful thing where Philip Roth says as a child he was embarrassed to use the word spatula. He thought it was Yiddish. And I think that for me, it was part of that. And I can remember having trouble in school that the words were used as though they didn't have that other meaning. So the nominative and accusative and the dative and the ablative, the teacher could have explained it. And that it was like they didn't have that history. History's interesting. So history of words is just one example that everything comes from somewhere. This has a lot of parts. That's the gutter. This is the spine. This is a perfect binding, which doesn't mean it's great. It means it's poured into glue. Anyway.
Yeah, and I think to be obsessed with the thingness of what you work with is what it is to be an artist. And to be a poet is to be obsessed with the thingness of words. And one manifestation of that is the history of words, right? What makes words not, in the words of my friend Jim Longenbach, a transparent container for meaning, right?
And then Blackacre encourages you to have Goldacre and Redacre.
Exactly.
And it sounds good. It's part of it is just that. And thing, you use your tongue goes to your upper teeth, and then it's back in your glottis. This is our material.
Yeah, exactly.
I'm also curious to have you both talk. I was so happy you read Goldacre, and I was so happy that you read Creole. They're two poems for me that feel like they do so much in conversation with your other work. And I am curious for both of you about how you pull tradition after tradition after tradition into poems, different lineages and references to poetry, to myth, to history. And it all seems like an accumulative new myth-making. Can you talk about that a little bit? As if the received myths are not adequate and there needs to be, or it's fun to invent a new and more bountiful set of associations.
One is aware that the particular political, cultural moment tells every story over again. Every story gets told over again. And every generation debunks and finds what was wrong. And you're always finding out new bits of history. Driving here my wife is driving the car, I'm in the passenger seat, we're yakking about this and that, And she says, did you know about the Miss America contest? Until the 50s, for 30 years, it was explicit, not implicit, explicit. Miss America contestants must be of the white race. I was a little boy in the 50s. It was still there. And now we know to, we hiss. We know to be shocked by it. What are we not shocked by now? What do we think shows that we're good people right now? So my point is not to scorn or villainize people who had that horrible, unashamed thing. Ellen said that then it was quite a long time before there was actually a contestant on stage who was not white. And all this to do with a chimerical thing. You know, it's worth reminding ourselves that race is unscientific. It's a cuckoo, it's a pathology. But then it's not just a pathology, because it's also a reality. And that story has to get told over and over again, lots of times. And the immigration laws that are still a big issue, in each generation, there's some, we have to keep out these people, or we have to let in these, and then we'll tell that story again. And who knew it was it's getting, and our kids and grandkids, if the world survives, will tell the story differently. That's one of the things art does. Anyway, that's an example of the story I heard today.
Yeah.
And this kind of relates to the etymology question. It also kind of relates to this conversation I was having with a friend of mine a couple of days ago, because I was thinking, well, why is it that so many of my favorite books of recent times, whether it's Lincoln in the Bardo or Wolf Hall, tell stories that I already know? Why am I so interested in retellings of those stories, whether it's the myth, whether it's the retelling of the myth or whatever? Why do we keep telling ourselves the same story? And in some ways, I think what we understand is that it is more powerful to tell an old story or to retell an old story than to tell a new story. Because a new story is like a new friend. I mean, yes, you're perfectly happy to meet them, but they're not someone who you have lived with all along. To retell an old story in a way that's persuasive is as if it's a member of your family, right? And so if you're going to say, there was a story about America, like I thought I knew what a story of America was. I thought, my parents are the American dream. They immigrated here, they started their own business. Isn't this what everyone thinks America is? But to have someone tell another story about America, no, America is something different. America is something that excludes you. America is something that you're not part of, is interesting.
I'll take it back to impurity, too. You tell the story of Yggdrasil. You're an American writer telling the story of Yggdrasil, and it's your story. Because Du Bois says at the end of essay on educating black folk, he says, I summon Aristotle, I sit with Shakespeare and he winces not. Once you're telling those stories, they're yours.
Yeah.
Coming out of my mouth. I didn't invent this language, my great-grandparents didn't speak it, it's mine. Because I'm talking it. And that's part of retelling, part of the whole idea of myth.
This kind of ties in a little bit, maybe, to the 2012 NPR feature. Both of you wrote poems for The Day in Verse. It was such an interesting project. I don't think it's still running, to my knowledge. I think it was a little bit short-lived. But I'm curious about that experience for both of you, too. How did that work?
I'm laughing because I'm so fucking old. I don't remember these things.
This is NPR, for all things considered. They make you the news poet for the day. They make you the news poet for the day, and they take you into the newsroom at 9 a.m. and you're supposed to listen to them go around the table being like, okay, this is what happened today, and this is what happened today, and this is what happened today, and then they give you literally 90 minutes with a donut and a cup of coffee or something, and they're just like, okay, so write a poem that's going to be read tonight on All Things Considered, and it's a little nerve-wracking, I have to say.
Did you publish yours?
Huh?
Did you publish
I
yours?
didn't end it. I ended up trashing mine, but I was kind of lucky, and my day happened to be the day, remember the blind Chinese dissident escaped, right? And that made a nice sort of thing to tie it all together. So I wrote a villanelle, because a villanelle helpfully has all these repeating lines, and I was like, well, that means I have fewer lines I have to write, even if they do have to rhyme. Rhyme I can do. So.
Yeah, I kept revising mine and published. It was a lot of fun.
Oh, it was very
I enjoyed it. I'm in the midst of a thing right now. I won't say too much about it, but the Washington Post magazine assigned a reporter, Katie Zavitsky, who I've seen her piece now. She's doing a piece on a current situation, and I have until July 1st to write a poem about the same thing. Oh. It's a lot different than the 90 minutes. Yeah. And I'm here to tell you it's going terribly. Let me put it this way.
I know, I had to do something in the wake of the 2016 election. They gave me like a week, and I was a wreck. But I ended up going back to another etymology thing. I was fascinated by the word mind, because I was thinking, I think like a lot of people after the election, you were kind of shuffling through your priorities. You're like, but what about the refugees? But what about immigration? But what about marriage equality? But what about Black Lives Matter? You just kept being like, what can I focus on? And people would say things like, oh, focus on your local issues, focus. And I kept thinking, well, how can I not, only concentrate on what's close to me and not concentrate on what's further out in a further sphere? And so I started thinking about the word mine and how strange it was that it's both a possessive and, a possessive pronoun, but also to mine, to dig up metal from the earth, something to do with materialism. And it turns out it's two separate etymologies. There's the Germanic mine, right? The possessive. And then there's a French etymology, which is the metal definition, to dig in the earth. And they
related to mineral, I think.
Yeah, exactly. And they just happen to come together in English into the same word, but it's fortuitous. And so I wrote a poem sort of about that.
Yeah. And I read that poem. I love that poem, actually. And I think you, in an interview about that poem, you said, I felt that I've allowed myself to get a little too fastidious, too comfortable in my comfort zone.
Well, I used to be an election lawyer, and as an election lawyer, it would be like, oh my God, Mitch McConnell did something this morning. You need to have a hot take editorial out in 1,000 words by, noon, right? Go, right. And, I could do that, but I was thinking, well, the time has come that I get to step back from the hot take editorial and not, have to respond immediately and to, be more contemplative and meditative and all of these nice poet virtues. But, different times call for different poems, or different, lots of different poems. I mean, Yeats was writing, you still hear his, his very anthemic poems, recited in the back of taxi cabs. At the same time, he was, writing much more complicated, much more multi-layered poems. And,
do you guys have questions for each other? I know you've spoken together, you've been at appearances many times over the years, and I wonder...
Actually, that only started like a year and a half, last couple of years.
Couple of years, we keep popping up in the same...
Yeah, which is fun.
Which is very nice, but to me it's a new friendship.
Yes.
But let's hear from them.
Yeah.
Don't just sit there. This better be good.
Let's have a few questions from you folks, and then maybe a couple of more poems would be lovely as well. But what questions do you have?
I have a
Please.
question. Your poem's short. I hadn't heard it before, so when you read it, as you were reading it, do you think of a poem like that as an expression of gratitude, an expression of like a grace that would be said at a meal? To say, thank you for the farmer for this food, thank you for the corn, that was cultivated by, these people. I got that feeling.
The short answer is yes.
Yeah.
Could you folks in the back hear the question? Okay, good.
The question is whether I had gratitude in the word. There was recently, there's an NPR series in poetry, they did an episode on that poem. And I'm very happy they talked to a woman who's a famous fashion buyer for, I think, Bergdorf Goodmans, and a young guy who's a very successful designer. And they point that out. Stuart Weitzman, the shoe designer, says at the beginning of the thing in my poem, he says, when we buy a garment, we think about its future. But anything that is handmade also has a past. That's related to the etymology thing. And I was very glad that two or three of those people say about those last lines, Irma inspected my shirt, that it is friendly and it's appreciating without denying the existence of sweatshops. The poem, I wrote the poem when I was living in Berkeley, and I read a story in the, on one level, we got good labor laws from that disaster, but I read a story this is in the late 80s, in the San Francisco Chronicle, about terrible sweatshops in San Francisco. People who don't speak English, basically imprisoned, almost slavery, and probably their legal status is shaky, and they're in terrible conditions, making our stuff. But I appreciate what you say very much, and I'm very happy in this recent TV thing. People in the garment business hear that I am trying to say, it's true of our food, that all sorts of things, that I'm at the top of a socioeconomic food chain, and I'm trying to remember with some gratitude that it has other parts.
Yeah, I thought it was brilliant and so rich.
Anyway,
in
thanks.
History and layers. That was fabulous.
Any other questions? Yeah.
Monica, I have two questions for you. One, can you tell us a little bit about your career change? That's very dramatic. And also, you shared with us poems that rhyme and don't rhyme. What goes into your decision along that line, whether to rhyme or not to rhyme in a poem?
I'll answer the second one first. I end up thinking that formal questions are questions of tone. What tone do you want for a particular piece? Do you want something to be more or less song-like? Do you want something to be, for that particular poem I was writing in Dr. Seuss meter, right? Twas the night before Christmas meter. I mean, it's the same meter, and if you want that sense, if you want that tone to your poem, then that's the meter you're going to use. For other poems, when I rhyme, it really, the degree of rhyme also is the tone I want to use. Do I want a more subtle rhyme that you have to, you hear kind of like an echo that sort of starts to come forward, or do I want something that is obviously musical, like kind of almost you could dance to it, so musical? And it's just a question of what you're going for in a particular poem. So the law question, I always did two things. I always did poetry and law. Kind of came to a crisis at 2 points in my life. The first was when I was telling Elizabeth a little bit about this. $180,000 in debt, fresh out of law school, and just having accepted a federal appellate clerkship, I got the Stegner Fellowship at Stanford, which I had only applied for because my dear friend, then Stephen, now Stephanie Burt at Harvard, had told me, oh, there's this thing called the Stegner, you should put in an application for it. Which is a 2-year postgraduate fellowship in creative writing at Stanford. And I had a nervous breakdown and went ahead and accepted the fellowship. The federal judge was like, basically, I will never hire anyone from your law school again. The dean of my law school yelled at me. My parents didn't speak to me for a year. It was a bit of a mess, but I'm so glad I did it. I got my first book done on that fellowship. And then, I kept working as a lawyer for about 14, 15 years after that. And then I was working, I was running the campaign finance reform project at the Brennan Center, dealing with Citizens United and its aftermath. And after about 3 years after Citizens United came down, I was like, well, the Supreme Court is not changing anytime soon. I have been trying to throw everything I can into the brakes to make us lose more slowly than we would otherwise lose. and there are a billion lawyers who want this job, and I can step out for a little while. So, and just at that time, Tracy K. Smith went on maternity leave at Princeton. Princeton invited me to come give a reading, and then they were like, hey, how about you sub for Tracy? And that was 6 years ago, and I've been there ever since. So, yeah, so it was a lot of luck went into it, but I'm just very glad I made those decisions when I did.
Other questions from you folks? Yeah.
I have actually two questions. One is with all there is to write about in the world that's going on, how do you decide on where to focus? And the second question is when you start a poem, do you know where you're going when you start it, or does it just have a life of its own that reveals itself as you're writing?
Robert Frost has this saying where he says, no surprise for the writer, no surprise for the reader, that it must be discovery. I don't think you decide what to write about. I mean, all of us have all these things you take very seriously. Political, sexual, culinary, familial, it's all there. You have a lot of feelings and ideas, and that's not a poem. For me, and I think for many people, I suspect to some extent for Monica, it's only a poem if you start, Yeats said, you get a tune in your head. So I'll go back to Shirt. That poem started, I thought I was going to write a poem about a woman who's a sculptor. And her work has black iron and wood in it. And when she was a child, her mother did piecework. She was her mother's sewing machine. And working on that poem, I realized, oh, the treadle, very beautiful, sure, he goes, the treadle, oh, treadle needle. Treadle needle, union, well, what we go, treadle, needle, mangle, needle, bobbin, the union. And then bobbin, needle treadle gave me bobbin union, and union gave me the triangle shirtwaist fire. And I never did write the poem about the sculptor.
You should do it.
And maybe someday. But it's like noodling at a piano or playing with clay. You just wait until something works out. So you're not choosing a subject. There are 1,000 subjects up there. And it would be, in a way, a great thrill, have a superpower to say, oh, I'll write about the Miss America contest. You know, every time you hear about something, you can write. It's not like that at all for me. It's once in a while, for one of those many things, you get a tune.
Yeah. Like something comes in to a frequency. Now, Michael Hoffman had a great description, or what he said was, it's like you're picking at wallpaper on the wall, and then you get a little edge and you start pulling. And I thought that was such a good description because, you know, you don't know when you're going to get, you find a little edge, and then it's not like you can pull off a perfect rectangle or a circle. I mean, you're always in negotiation with the material, and there's some degree of your intentionality, but there's some degree of the material just wants to go that way, so it's just going to go that way,
yeah.
and then it's going to end where it's going to end, and you will keep it going hopefully as long as you can, but at some point you have just come to the end of it.
Yeah.
We have time for one more question, then we should hear a couple of poems. Yeah.
Robert, can you tell us about the jazz project that you do and how that connects with poetry?
I work with jazz musicians. We'll be doing it. I'll be with the cellist, Catherine Bent. I'm very excited about Catherine Bent, Stan Strickland, Lawrence Hobgood, and I think it's July 11th, 10th or 11th at Castle Hill. And these are performing, Joshua and I were talking about starting with music, and I'm a non-singing vocalist. I try to, it's somewhat improvisatory, and I've done a couple of CDs with Lawrence, and for me they're deeply related arts, not in the way of setting words to music. That's different. I have a lot of respect for songwriting, opera, all that. This is more like a conversation between the melodies of sentences and their rhythms and the melodies and rhythms and harmonies of the poems. Stan Strickland said a thing, I want to put this in writing sometime. He said that music has melody, rhythm, and harmony. It's also true in poetry. The harmony is the like sounds. Yeah. Every sentence has a melody. Da-da-ba-ba-ba-ba-doo-doo. Was that a question? Was a question. And Stan said, what do you think came first? Harmony, melody, rhythm. He says, most people will say rhythm. Melody. That melody is so basically expressive. Cats and dogs do it. And you can, once you think about it, that's pitch. That's all pitch. Anyway, I love it.
I have the flyer here. So I can tell you, it's Wednesday, July 11th, 6:30 p.m. at the Wellfleet Preservation Hall, and it's being sponsored by the Castle Hill, so probably a fundraiser for them.
Bless you.
Yes.
Thank you.
Thanks, Lucy. Very cool.
It sounds corny. That works in our favor. It sounds like it's going to be embarrassing. Then people say, oh, not that bad. I have a lot of belief in it.
I have this whole list of other questions we could talk about, but I think your own poems say so much, and we don't get to hear you read in person very often. So can we hear one more and then mingle and chat?
I'll go first and let Robert close off the evening.
Okay.
So this is kind of in response to Josh's rhyme question. So this is a poem that uses various degrees of rhyme. It's based on a dance performance by Martha Graham, a piece of choreography from 1930 called Lamentation. It's a classic piece, some of you may know it. And in it, the dancer is encased in a seamless blue tube of fabric. So all that you can see are her face, her hands, and her feet. And she dances the entire dance, making various shapes in that constraint. And I think Martha Graham said something like she wanted to show how grief obsesses the body. But I used the same, it's a single sentence poem that uses the same rhyme sound throughout, although the rhyme changes quite a bit in terms of its slant. So it becomes more recognizable and less recognizable at points, but you're still within that same constraint of the rhyme, all the way down a fairly long, skinny, tubular poem. So, Blue Acre. Wordless, ceaseless, a second seamless skin, this blue refrain sings of comfort, camouflage, the rarest right to remain faceless, featureless, the barest ruin of ruin, a chessboard pawn that rears up into a castle, then topples in defeat, an exposed vein on a stretched out throat, pulsing frantically as if to drain unwanted thoughts into the body's reservoir, an inky stain bluer than blushing, truer than trusting, the shadow zone at the core of the flame, too intense, too airless, to long remain enveloped, as if a moth lured to the light were trapped, sewn back in its cocoon, the way the pitiless mind goes on shape-making, gamma, lambda, chi, a linked chain of association, no less binding for being silken, a fine mesh net thrown over the exhausted animal, having given up its vague, vain efforts at escape, and now struggling merely to sustain a show of resistance, to extend a limb toward extremity, to glean one glimpse of light, one gasp of air, then folding inward, diving down into the blue pool at the body's hollow center, there to float and drown.
I'm going to read two, but they're short. I want to read this one because whenever I'm on the Cape, my wife and I think about the person who so much embodies the Cape for us, my dear friend, the great painter Michael Mazer. And This poem is called Grief. I'll read this, and then I'll read another one sort of congruent with Blue Acre. Grief. I don't think anybody ever is really divorced, said Lenny. Also, I don't think anybody ever is really married, he said. Because English was really his second language, and because of Yiddish and its displaced place in the world, he never really believed in his own prose. He wrote sentences the way a great boxer moves. Near the end, he told me, I'm in hell. Something that Lenny might have said about hunting for a parking space in Berkeley. Mike, too, was himself. His last month, too weak to paint or make prints, he sat and made drawings of flowers, ink attentive to rhythms of beach rose, wisteria, lily, forms like acrobats or Cossack dancers. Mike had a vision of his body dead on the studio floor, seen from high above. He didn't feel sad or afraid at seeing it, he said, just sorry for the person who would find it. You can't say nobody ever really dies. Of course they do. Lenny died. Mike died. But the odd thing is, the person still makes a shape distinct and present in the mind as an object in the hand. The presence in the absence. It isn't comfort, it's grief. So rather than end with that one, thank you, Monica. I will end with a poem called Rhyme. I chose to put it first in my selected poems. Rhyme, air an instrument of the tongue an instrument of the body an instrument of the spirit a being of the air. Each bird the medium of its song, each song a world, a containment, like a hotel room, ready for us guests who inherit our compartment of time there. In the Joseph Cornell box, among ephemera as its element, the preserved bird, a study in spontaneous elegy, the parrot, art, mortal in its cornered sphere. Each room a stanza rung in a laddered filament, clambered by all us unsteadied, chambered voices that share it, each one reciting, I too was here. I too was here, in a room, a rhyme, a song, in the box, in books, each element an instrument, the body still straining to parrot the spirit, a being of the air.